Welcome to a new edition of Let's Talk About Something Else, presented by the BBC. My name is Lucas Donnelly, and today we'll debate, analyze and discuss the case of Nokia. It is a story which you might have heard of, but here in Let's Talk About Something Else, we're going to show you the inside of the story, what happened behind the scenes, the things that were not made public, and afterwards we'll make a deeper analysis on what is discussed. Nokia, as you all know, is an organization that was born and grew to become one of the leaders, one of the most important in the world. Then hit rock bottom and was later able to recover, or sort of. Before starting the analysis, a little contextualization. Finland was founded in 1865 in Finland, originally to produce paper. Over the years, the company expanded and extended its production to other areas, until in 1967 the corporation began to produce network equipment and mobile radio telephony. Kari Kairamo was hired by Nokia in 1967. 10 years later, he was appointed the new CEO of the corporation. As such, his mission was, and I quote, to build Nokia fast into an internationally large multi-industry company. Until the 1980s, Nokia commercialized its industrial products mainly with the Soviet Union, but under Kairamo's leadership, Nokia grew as an international organization targeting mainly Western Europe. This, in 1988, brought several consequences. Finnish banks and the media declared themselves against Kairamo's management style, which led to a severe crisis within the organization that brought a massive debt and a catastrophic share value loss that would end up with Kairamo committing suicide the same year. And this is how we start the program. Don't get up of your seats. We'll have more information, interviews, and a couple of special guests to analyze what happened to Nokia after this tragic event. Hello, we're here back at Let's Talk About Something Else, discussing and analyzing the Nokia case. You might be thinking by this time, what does all of this have to do with Nokia's current situation? Well, making a long story short, as from 1988, Nokia's new board of directors led to a major change in company culture. They understood they had to be extremely careful with growth expectancies and ensure that the company had a very low public profile, but extremely high, efficient standards within their processes. This made them very successful, to the point of having mobile market leadership by 1998 and owning 40% of this market by 2007. But it is as from this year that everything started to change. It was this year that Apple launched the iPhone, and in 2008, Google developed Android iOS. Nokia's mobile phones would not be a match for these new products, and this can clearly be evidenced in the company's annual revenues report. According to the Wall Street Journal, by April 2009, Nokia's reported profits was of $161 million in their first quarter, which was sort of a 90% drop in relation to the same period in 2008. So, to analyze what went wrong, I am pleased to introduce Drs. Mahnoor and Hanna, both professors at Harvard University and experts in the field of change and organizational leadership. Mahnoor, Hanna, it is an honor for me to have you both at the studio.
Thank you so much for having us here.
Yeah, thank you.
My pleasure. So, the introduction of the iPhone and the new Android definitely changed the market, and that led to Nokia's downfall. Professors, why wasn't Nokia able to change in time to compete against this iPhone?
Yes, so to begin with, the news of the iPhone and the Android had a major impact on Nokia's company culture, or rather, it actually worsened their company culture. This is a big reason why they were unable to change quickly enough to keep up with the market. And we can analyze this quickly using McKinsey's 7S model. Specifically, the structure, their shared values, and their style. So if you think about the structure, Nokia can be described as an organization with a hierarchical structure. The new management after Kairamo brought in many new sections of levels, where each level was trying to avert risks and ensure efficient viability in any situation.
So, that must have made it very difficult to make innovative phones quickly. It makes me think as if they were trying to control and verify everything.
Yes, absolutely. And because of the structure, the information that was given on each level was not flowing freely inside, and the company therefore wasted energy on slow decision making. So any creative ideas suggested by the engineers and the employees were like buried under this bureaucracy that was in the structure. And this slow decision making and bureaucracy meant that Nokia could not respond quickly enough to the iPhone and could not only offer the market much more modest features in comparison.
That's an interesting point. I wonder why they didn't change their very bureaucratic style even when competition became very intense.
That's an excellent question. So this is actually something that is very deeply rooted in the culture of Nokia. So when Kari Karaimo was CEO of Nokia, his energetic management style led to a lot of showy business acquisitions and some good things, but also led to a lot of issues later on that new generations had to deal with. So his acquisitions didn't really pan out, the stocks dropped by 40%, and the large banks were quite unhappy with his management style. So when he tragically committed suicide later on, the new generation of management really had to grapple with a lot of those issues, and in a way, they had to make a lot of changes. So interestingly, in a paper by Reagan et al. That kind of examines emotional arcs and stories, the authors describe how stories have immense power to transfer information and also define our existence. So looking at Nokia's story, we can easily identify that the emotional arc here is that of Icarus. So a riches to rags story that aligns really perfectly with Nokia's initial success with Karaimo and then their downfall with Karaimo. So this story and emotional arc is clearly very relevant to Nokia and served as a cautionary tale for upper management. As a result of this underlying emotional arc, what we see with Nokia during the time when the iPhone launched around 2007 is that Nokia had completely transformed itself by that time. So at the time of 2007, new management was uncomfortable with spontaneous leadership and was convinced that problems that occurred were due to poor planning and analysis. So for that reason, that is really why we see the rationalized management methods that Hanna described, and why they really focused not on being innovative in the sector, but rather on expanding mobile features gradually and continuing on a course of very risk-averse culture.
Wow, it sounds like if they were really like traumatized with this, and it clearly shows that it had a very like long-lasting effect over the company.
Yes, exactly. It had a very long-lasting effect on the company. As we can see, what happened with Karaimo happened in like the late 80s, early 90s, and yet even by 2007, when all of these changes were happening in the market, Nokia was so reluctant to do anything because of all that trauma. So, in fact, the visionary aspect that had made the company so successful earlier on with Karaimo was replaced with that audit culture that we had mentioned earlier, led by finance, and it was supported by several layers of bureaucracy, all determined to do their own checks. So these changes were all motivated by the Icarus emotional arc that I mentioned earlier, and specifically in an attempt not to suffer the same fate that they had when Karaimo was CEO. So this one aspect is definitely a big reason why they were unable to compete against Apple effectively, and especially when we consider that their competitors, Apple and Android, were so much more innovative and risk-tolerant.
Wow, it is amazing how one single event can have a so long-term consequence upon Nokia, no?
Yeah.
Professor Olsen, you also mentioned something about style. Could you elaborate a little bit about that?
Yes, of course. The generation of managers that was raised or that raised their positions in the 1990s saw Nokia nearly destroyed by Karaimo in the 1980s. So this new generation wanted to keep a low public profile and focus on developing the business operations professionally according to their internal rules. So the new managers wanted to distance themselves from the fast-paced mentality of the 1980s.
Yes.
So they created a hierarchy where the arrogance was high among the top-level managers. This created an organizational fear grounded in a culture of temperamental leaders and frightened middle managers. This only became worse when the iPhone launched in 2007, and the competition became more intense. And middle managers were therefore scared of telling the truth about how they were progressing with the new phones they made because they were feared of being fired.
Yeah.
On the other hand, the top managers were afraid of the external environment and not meeting their quarterly targets. Top managers intimidated middle managers by accusing them of not being ambitious enough to meet their goals.
Wow, I see. That must have made it extremely difficult to communicate honestly and yes, would have naturally slowed down the progress, making new phones develop, like to compete with the iPhone.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And how can like any progress be made, and how can you compete effectively if no one is telling the truth about what is actually going on internally and also externally?
Exactly.
So the communication was not flowing properly, which made it extremely difficult for Nokia to change in time to compete.
What about people's values? Can you talk something about it?
Yes. So the arrogance of the top managers, as I said, created an atmosphere of fear, which got more intense when the changes occurred in the market, so the external. And there were also no social networks internally in the company, since the CEO of Nokia didn't believe in that. His vision was that as an employee, you have to work hard if you want to be successful, and with no other disruptions. So the salvation of the employees was guaranteed by hard work, and they had no incentive to be innovative or revolutionize anything. They were just focused on doing their everyday job.
I see, Professor. So Nokia didn't value any innovation at all. That must have definitely affected their ability to change and to compete against iPhone.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point. So that actually ties in really nicely with the storytelling going on in the organization at this time. So Nokia had been suffering from an illusion of eternal success, which was fueled by the fact that they had been able to overcome the issues that had plagued their company in the 90s and the early 2000s. So this created a pervasive overcoming the monster type story throughout their organization. Essentially, they believed that they were infallible and could eventually overcome any obstacle thrown their way. Thus, when the iPhone released in 2007, it really wasn't taken seriously as a threat, despite the fact that there were several signs pointing to the fact that it was a serious development in the market. However, based on the overcoming the monster stereotype, they just had a lot of confidence and were pretty much overconfident that they could tackle it and they didn't really need to change. So that really is the reason why they made no effort to change and actually failed to change when it mattered the most.
That's interesting. Well, I've read up some analysis about Nokia that spoke about several issues between top management and middle management about that time.
Yes, definitely. There were a lot of issues between these two levels. We could for sure say that the management adopted a mixture of power between legitimate and coercive, mostly coercive power. And this use of coercive power was very pronounced during this turbulent period.
This coercive power you mentioned, Hanna, it must have affected other employees. Can you think of any consequences that might have brought middle managers and Nokia's ability to change to face the competition?
Yes, of course, there's a lot of consequences. And the coercive form among the top managers created an organizational fear that was grounded in the culture of temperamental leaders and frightened middle managers. So the middle managers did not dare to tell the leaders the truth because they were so afraid of being fired. So the top managers intimidated their middle manager by accusing them of not being ambitious enough to meet their goals, which again led middle management feeling that they're telling the truth about what their work was useless. So this is a very good example of coercive form of power.
That must have been a very difficult environment so as to work with. In which ways did this affect Nokia?
Oh, it had a huge impact. Fear was showing at all levels in the hierarchy, making Nokia weak and unable to change effectively. This made the firm vulnerable for competitive forces such as Apple, because the atmosphere of fear internally influenced how the employees were interacting with each other, and also how the employees expressed that top managers were not longer abiding to Nokia's core values of respect, challenge, and renewal. So this made the top managers' legitimate power to fade. Their authority was no longer as important to their employees as it used to, making them see that telling the truth was useless. So this massively derailed their ability to compete with iPhone and Android effectively.
So it's very interesting for you to mention that.
Yeah.
So the coercive form of power is actually also linked to the power of resources, as elaborated on by Cynthia Hardy in her paper about understanding power. So top management clearly had the power of resources, which is essentially the power to fire and hire, to punish, and to give rewards. So this definitely allowed them to exercise tight control over middle management. However, Hardy describes that there's actually a limit to this power of resources. Essentially, when you use it too much, it starts to become counterproductive. And this is seen clearly at Nokia, as we can see. At a certain point, middle management simply was promising anything in regards to new product development to face the iPhone, even if it was unreasonable or unfeasible or wouldn't be completed within the allotted time, just to make sure that they weren't punished or pestered by top management. So obviously, within the organization, this led to incorrect and inaccurate ideas of how Nokia was actually progressing relative to competitors, and it was actually a big part of the reason why they weren't able to change in a way that would have helped them face the competition.
So to conclude, this coercive power Nokia directors used created like a fear atmosphere among the employees, making them less willing to tell the truth, if I understood well, to the top managers about what was going on within the organization at the time that Apple launched the iPhone.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Exactly.
So, Dr. Faruqi, I know you have a PhD in sense making.
Yes.
Could you relate that to this case?
Yeah, of course. So in regards to Nokia's failure to enact change at this critical time, it's definitely very important to dissect the sense-making that was probably taking place at the time. So Sandberg and Sukas helpfully lay out major constituents of sense-making and outline that sense-making is actually often influenced by other factors such as context, identity, and emotions. So as Professor Olson described earlier, the social context at the time was that middle management was incredibly frightened of top management and felt unable to tell them the truth about how they were progressing in terms of new developments. In terms of industrial context, clearly Nokia was suffering with a lot of competition, a lot of new entrants in the market. However, top management decided not to tell middle management about these new developments just so that they wouldn't create panic or fear in the company. In regards to identity, Nokia's identity at the time was that of the infallible company, as I mentioned earlier, and it was grounded strongly by both the Icarus emotional arc as well as the overcoming the monster storyline. So these both led to a reluctance to do anything revolutionary or innovative, due to both Nokia's turbulent past, where innovation, they kind of saw that them as being punished for being too innovative, and they also felt very overly confident because thus far their very rational, bureaucratic method of running their company had worked so well and had allowed them to deal with previous problems. Lastly, it's also important to address how emotions affected the sense-making process.
Yes, I think that's very important. Emotions. They may have played a big part in Nokia's inability to change in this case.
Yeah, I think in this case, especially when it comes to sense-making, emotions are really important in terms of how they impacted the sense-making process. So, as we mentioned earlier, there were clearly high levels of emotion, especially fear, present at all levels of this organization. So this is actually a key factor because Sandberg and Sukas mentioned that when there are high levels of fear and anxiety present, that can hinder the sense-making process and actually make it difficult for people to extract external cues properly. So this is evidently what happened at Nokia. Top management was so frightened that they couldn't really analyze the external market properly and come up with a proper strategy. And middle management was so frightened by top management that they kind of just blindly accepted whatever they were told and didn't really try to look at the bigger picture.
To see the effects fear can have upon employees and managers within a company.
Yeah, definitely. It can have such a huge effect. All in all, the context really made it impossible for anyone in Nokia to tell the truth. Identity made it difficult for Nokia to break away from the shackles of their past. And the high levels of fear and anxiety at Nokia rendered it really difficult for employees to pick out the important external cues that would have helped them in this sense-making process. So these three factors negatively impacted the sense-making process during this turbulent time and resulted in very poor outcomes.
So this has been a very interesting and eye-opening discussion up to now. And I think that taking all these points into account, and professors remind me if I forgot something, Nokia then failed mainly due to their inflexible culture, to the use of the coercive power Hanna talked about, this emotional arc and the storytelling, and the several issues they had with sense-making. All of this triggered by the appearance of new competitors that rocket up to become market leaders, such as Apple and Google. Am I right, professors?
Yeah, you're exactly right.
Great.
So my main takeaway from this case is how important it is to keep your organization flexible and keep it innovative. If you don't keep changing internally and trying to keep up with what's going on in the world, any external change could really just completely derail your organization, like in this case.
Yes, and I mean that you should always be open for change and don't let the past failures affect your company's future.
Excellent. Thank you very much, professors, for coming today. And thank you for accompanying us today. My name is Lucas Donnelly, and this has been the end of a new edition of Let's Talk About Something Else, presented by the BBC. See you next time.